This is the Natural History Museum. Welcome to NHM Live.
In a couple of minutes, you'll be meeting one of our scientists.
This is your chance to ask some questions directly.
We look forward to hearing from you. Let's find out who our scientist is today.
I'm Chris Stringer and I'm a research leader in human origins here at the Natural History Museum. I came here in 1973 and I've been here ever since, and of course it's a fantastic place to work. It's a beautiful building, wonderful collections, good facilities, and of course a great group of colleagues. So those are all reasons why I'm still here after more than 40 years. The work I do, well, it's wide-ranging. So my core work is on researching the origins of our own species, Homo sapiens, and related people like the Neanderthals. But I've also been involved in the last 17 or 18 years in work on the early history of Britain. We know people got here at least 900,000 years ago, so researching that early history is part of my work. And of course, part of my work is to do with outreach and working with the public, so I was heavily involved in the creation of the Human Evolution exhibition here, which we're very proud of.
Hi everyone, welcome to NHM Live. I'm Alison and I'm your host for this week's show, where we're talking human evolution with Professor Chris Stringer. Now remember, we are going out live, so if you do have any questions for Chris, please do send those in and we'll get through as many of them as we can. Now Chris, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's a pleasure.
Now we thought that we would concentrate today on the Neanderthals. So it's a species that we all know, we know the name at least, I think we know them, but there are perhaps a few misconceptions about the Neanderthals. So if we start by introducing them, who were they and when were they around?
Well, they were people who had a long evolutionary history, so they were around in Europe, at least their line of evolution, probably for at least 400,000 years, so they go back a long way. And they lived in Europe and Asia, they lived in different environments, and of course while they were evolving in Europe and Asia, our ancestors were evolving in Africa.
When was the first Neanderthal fossil discovered?
Well, the one that gave its name to the group was found in the Neander Valley in Germany, Neanderthal, in 1856, but actually two Neanderthals had been found earlier than that, but not recognised at the time. One of them was the Gibraltar Neanderthal from Forbes Quarry. That had been found in 1848, but sat on a museum shelf for another 15 years or more. And in fact, a child skull of a Neanderthal had been found in Belgium in 1830, but it took another 100 years for that to be recognised as Neanderthal.
Wow, we didn't know what we had. That's
right.
Fascinating.
Yes.
And you can actually see the first adult skull here at the museum, can't you?
That's right, yes. The real fossil is on show in our Human Evolution Gallery.
Now, we tend to think of the Neanderthals as being quite primitive. There's that whole sort of caveman archetype. Is that fair?
Yes, I'm afraid they're stuck with that image problem. So Neanderthal is used as an insult today by reactionary behaviour, bad behaviour. And that is unfair because the Neanderthals were very evolved humans. They had brains as large as ours. They walked upright as well as we do. They were not ape men, they were very evolved humans. But they were distinct from us, so I think they were a distinct species. I refer to them as Homo neanderthalensis.
Now you mentioned their large brains. We've got some skulls here. Which one is the Neanderthal?
Yeah, so here we've got a replica of a Neanderthal fossil from France, about 50,000 years old, and we've actually got a modern human one from France that's about 20,000 years old. So you can see the comparison of the Neanderthal and the modern human. And so that Neanderthal, yes, human, it's got a very large brain, but as you can see, the shape of the brain case is different between the modern human and the Neanderthal. So Neanderthal brain case shape is longer and lower, and at the front, of course, you've got that characteristic brow ridge, which is not well developed in modern humans, and the face is also especially distinctive. So Neanderthals had very big noses, pulled forwards, the side of the face sloping back, and the internal volume of that nose was very large, and we think that might be an adaptation for living in colder, drier environments mostly, and that nose is humidifying and warming up the air as it goes down.
Of course. What do we know about how they actually lived?
Well, they lived off the land. They were hunter-gatherers, so they had to forage for their food. They certainly hunted large mammals. They would have scavenged at times, but also plant resources were important for them. So we know that from even the deposits on their teeth. So the stuff the dentist scrapes off your teeth, tartar, if that sets hard, we call it calculus. So on Neanderthal teeth, that has actually given us direct evidence of what they were putting in their mouths. It shows us that they were indeed eating a range of plant resources and fungi as well.
It's amazing, you can tell that from tartar.
That's right, and the sad thing is that for many years this stuff was scraped off the teeth on the fossils because it looked untidy. We lost a lot of information there.
Now we've got a question from Andrew on Facebook, and he's asking, do you think Neanderthals had spoken language? That's a very good question.
That is a very difficult one because obviously the tissue associated with the voice box doesn't preserve. So socially, when we look at the complexity of their lives, I think they must have spoken to each other. They must have planned things. Their lives were complex, but it's possible that their language was a simpler language than ours. They may have lived in smaller groups. Their communication might have been more about everyday things. Maybe they didn't have deep concepts of time and spirituality and abstraction in the way that we do.
Do we think there are any signs of culture in the Neanderthals and similar to modern humans?
Well, certainly they were cultural beings in the sense that, yes, I mean, they made tools for their everyday lives. The ones we preserve best, of course, are stone ones, but they also would have used wood and other materials. And the stone tools, Neanderthals were very capable stone tool makers. And certainly at the latter part of their time, they were able to make fire. We don't know whether they could do it at will all the time or whether they sometimes captured fire, but fire is certainly part of their adaptation as well, at least in the last couple of 100,000 years of their existence.
So quite resourceful, possibly.
Certainly, and they had to be, because at times they were living in very challenging environments during the so-called ice ages, you know, living in Britain, Germany, Poland at those times, really challenging environments, very cold, very dry. So life was hard, and the fact they survived in those environments is a testament to their abilities.
Absolutely. Now we've got a question from 10X on Periscope, and he's asking, how large was their population at its peak?
Again, very difficult to tell that. So we know from the genetics that they were not very variable. So they're, at least the ones we've got the best data for, show rather low genetic variation. Difficult to get a real figure, but by modern terms, very low. I mean, we're talking at times probably tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people, nothing like the figures we have today. But that was also true even for our ancestors in Africa. You know, they would have been in the hundreds of thousands, maybe a million or so, but you know, spread out very thinly over the landscape. So these numbers were really small compared with our numbers now.
I always find it quite fascinating that we actually have Neanderthal DNA. We've sequenced their DNA.
That's right, yes, and so this is mainly work in the last 20 years or so. But yes, we now have very high quality genomes of some Neanderthals, and we can compare that with our own, with chimpanzees. There's these other people called the Denisovans who lived in Siberia, relatives of the Neanderthals. Again, we've got high quality genomes of those people as well, and that's giving us a lot of information, of course.
It's fascinating. Now we've got another question from Periscope. Dig Trace 3D is asking, does the museum do research on environmental DNA?
Environmental DNA, so does it mean their environments from cave? I'm not quite sure what the question is, but certainly recently there's been the ability to get DNA from cave sediments. I'm not sure whether that's what the question's about. And this means that even when you haven't got a fossil or bones in the sediment, you may have traces of the DNA of all the animals that lived in that cave and the plants that were in there, the fungi that were growing there. All of that can be preserved in the cave sediment, and people now are beginning to unlock that from the caves. And this includes DNA of Neanderthals. So we're involved in that research.
It's fascinating. And Briemma on Periscope is asking, do you think they had language and symbolic capabilities? So we've mentioned language already.
Yes, so again, it depends what level you mean, but there is evidence, at least from the last Neanderthal sites, that some of them seem to have been producing jewellery, body adornment. So in a sense, that's symbolic if you're sending a message about yourself to other people. So that's a degree of symbolism. But so far, in my view at least, we haven't got representational art from Neanderthal times. So when we get to the modern humans, in the last 40,000 years, we see painted animals on cave walls, we see statuettes of people and animals. No evidence of that yet, I think, clearly from Neanderthal sites. So there may have been some differences in the level of symbolic expression.
It's fascinating. And we've got another question from DigTrace3D asking, do we know what types of plants Neanderthals would have eaten? What species of sedges? Can we tell to that level?
Yes, so yes, you can go down and there are claims that the Neanderthals even at times ate plants that would have had medicinal properties.
Wow.
Yeah, that would have helped to soothe wounds or kill pain. One of the problems with that is that, and I've been involved in some research with colleagues, including Laura Buck, the Neanderthals might also have been eating the stomachs of their prey. So of course, if you eat a deer or a reindeer, if you eat its stomach contents, you get all the plant material that animal was eating quite neatly packaged for you in that meal. So they could have got some of their plant materials from actually eating the stomach contents of their prey. So maybe not directly collecting it, but using the animals as a very direct way of getting it.
Absolutely, very, very handy. Now we've got a question from Victor on Facebook saying, what characteristics should be present in a missing link between Neanderthals and humans theoretically?
Okay, well obviously from my point of view, there wasn't a direct evolutionary relationship. So when I began my research, more than 40 years ago, the dominant view was that Neanderthals had evolved into us. So if we had Neanderthal fossils and a continuous record, we would see them gradually changing into modern humans in Europe and in the Middle East. That isn't what happened. So there is no direct link between them in evolutionary terms, but we had a common ancestor. So if we go back to probably 500,000 years or a bit before, we therefore find those lines coming together in a common ancestor, which may have lived in Europe or Asia or Africa, we don't know. And then those lines split and we have the evolution of Neanderthals in Europe and Asia and our evolution in Africa. So yes, we go back to a link, but it's a common ancestor more than 500,000 years ago. And we've got skulls here of earlier forms. So this is a possible Neanderthal ancestor from more than 400,000 years old from Spain. And here's a possible Homo sapiens ancestor, recently the dating published, that's about 300,000 years old from Morocco. So as we go back in time, you can see these fossils are more primitive than the later examples. And of course, they're approaching that common ancestor we had with the Neanderthals.
So we had that common ancestor, then we diverged.
Yes.
So we do have key physical differences between modern humans and Neanderthals. What are those key differences?
Yes, so I've mentioned in the skull, that longer lower skull and the brow ridges, the big face, not much of a chin on the lower jaw. And in terms of their body skeleton, Neanderthals very strongly built, barrel-chested, very broad shoulders, very broad hips, and obviously high muscularity, quite a lot of bone strength. Their lives were physically very demanding, and their skeletons were built for those very demanding lives.
Of course. Now, speaking of the facial differences between modern humans and Neanderthals, I was over at Imperial College next door earlier in the week, finding out about a project that touches on just this subject. Let's take a look. So I'm here at Imperial College to find out a little bit more about a project that could help bring us a little closer to our Neanderthal cousins. I'm joined today by Alan, part of the project team. Alan, thank you for showing us around today. So you've been taking 3D scans of people's faces, is that right?
Yeah, so this project essentially began a while ago when we scanned a lot of faces at the Science Museum. And it was really for a project where we're trying to understand the difference between children with facial deformity and the rest of the population so that we could plan treatments and surgery for them. We collected so much data that I really needed an expert to help us analyse this. Then I met Stefanos here at Imperial, and since then we've been working on analysing this data. And we thought, there are a lot of other things we can do with this. And as I'd previously worked with the Natural History Museum on scanning some skulls, I re-engaged and we discussed a really exciting project. And we're now able to scan people's faces and show them what they might look like if they'd lived in a previous era, such as the Neanderthal era.
So can you talk us through the scanning and morphing technology itself? How does it work?
So actually there are quite a large variety of technologies available in my lab. The most unobtrusive one is the one that works directly from a single image, so I can reconstruct your face directly from a single image.
Wow.
You can see an example here. So we have a single image here and we can reconstruct the face of this lady with the exact expression, as you can see.
That's remarkable.
With a single image. But for this particular project, we want something that is more accurate. So we can reconstruct the face by moving a 3D camera around and accumulating a lot of scans so that we have something that it is quite accurate, as well as something that resembles more on your actual facial structure.
Okay, so I'm about to be scanned. What do you need me to do?
First of all, I want you to be as still as possible, okay? I don't want you to look at the sensor while we do the scanning. Basically, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna hold the scanner like this, and I'm gonna do a circular move around your head like that to get a lot of images of you and fuse them together afterwards to build the 3D version of you in the computer, all right? So we can begin actually. I want you to be still. Try not to look at the camera. Try to look at the fixed point. And 1, 2, 3, and go. All right. Very good. Hold still. So right now, I'm scanning your face from multiple angles. And once we're done, you're going to be able to see yourself in 3D.
So we have my scan image. What happens next?
So right now, we pick an image. We recorded a lot of images of you, so we pick an image of you, and so this is one sample of the images, and afterwards, we detect your face in that particular image, and in that image, as you can see here, we extract the points, the landmarks of your face, and we bring your face and your 3D mesh in correspondence with the Neanderthal model, and then we morph it so to get the morphing version of you in the end.
Okay, can we take a look?
So,
oh wow!
in my left hand, in the left side of the screen, you can see yourself. It's the 3D scan of you, and on the right hand side, you can see the Neanderthal model of you. And you can see how different is the nose area, and the lips are more puffy, and the eyebrow, it's extended, and you can see the difference.
So you've definitely got that Neanderthal brow ridge.
Yeah. If I turn it on the side, you can see the difference. Yep.
Fantastic. This is a prototype, is it?
Yeah, it's a prototype. We're still working on it. We are going to do a lot of more things to make it more accurate as well. And we're still working on getting the color and more accurate results out of it.
Fantastic. I look forward to seeing it. Yeah. What a brilliant way of engaging people with human evolution. Hi everyone, welcome back. And for those of you just joining us, we're talking human evolution and Neanderthals with Professor Chris Stringer. If you've got any questions for Chris, do send them in and we'll try to answer as many as we can. Now, Chris, the questions are coming through thick and fast now. Now, a very interesting question from 2 Tactical on Periscope, asking how did we survive when the Neanderthals didn't?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and the simple answer is we don't yet know the answer. I mean, obviously we are the only species left now. That's the weird thing. You know, we go back even 100,000 years ago, and there were several different lines of human coexisting on the Earth. There was us, there were the Neanderthals, there were these people called the Denisovans over in the Far East, possibly Homo erectus surviving in Southeast Asia, and this weird thing called Homo floresiensis, that nicknamed the Hobbit on the island of Flores. So the weird thing is now there's only one of us, and yet through most of human evolution you've had multiple lineages. So one view is that we are the reason why we're the only ones left, that as modern humans increase their capabilities, in a sense as an invasive species, we spread out and replace those other species. But of course it may not have been a total replacement.
Absolutely, because we do think there's some interbreeding going on, don't we?
Well, that's right, yes. So we've argued about this for many years, and some people thought they could see in early modern fossils maybe some signs of Neanderthal. I was very cautious about that, and my view was that yes, they probably could have interbred, because we know that many closely related mammal and bird species can still hybridize. So I always thought it was possible, but my view was, well, it happened 50,000 years ago. If it did happen, it was on a small scale, it wouldn't have been normal behavior. we're never going to find it today. And I was wrong about that, because it is there, and you and I probably have around 2% Neanderthal in us from interbreeding that happened maybe 50 or 60,000 years ago.
Do you know how much you have?
Well, it's been tested by 2 different testing companies, and they were different levels, because they don't do the whole genome, so you get a partial genome done. One gave about 2.5% Neanderthal, the other gave about 1.7% Neanderthal, and the average for us should be close to 2%. Yeah.
Now, we mentioned Flores there. We have had a question through from Richard Wilson on Periscope. He's asking, how did Flores get to their island if they didn't use boats?
Well, that's a very good question too, because we don't know. We think that lineage arrived probably more than 1 million years ago on the island of Flores. And the usual assumption is that you'd have to have boats to get there, because this island was never connected to the rest of Southeast Asia. There was always deep water. But one possibility is rafting on debris. Now, it may seem extraordinary, but of course that tsunami a few years ago in Asia, people were found out at sea, 100 miles away from where they started, out at sea on clumps of vegetation a week later. So this is a tectonically very active area. When you've got tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of years to play with, is it possible that the ancestors of Homo floresiensis were, in some mangrove swamps foraging? A tidal wave came along and ripped that away and somehow deposited them over on Flores. That's a possibility. Having boats, well, you couldn't exclude it, but I think it's much less likely for creatures with very small brains that are much more primitive.
It is absolutely fascinating. And now back to the relationship between humans and Neanderthals and the interbreeding. So Andrew Marchinson on Facebook is asking, do you think Neanderthals and modern humans could have communicated, had shared values perhaps even?
Well, obviously, if there was interbreeding, there obviously was a connection. How much of it was a social and cultural connection, we don't know at the moment. We don't know the circumstances of the interbreeding. So was it friendly? Was it rape? Was it capturing females? Was it bringing up adopted babies? All those are possibilities that could have happened. So if Neanderthals were speaking, to each other, could they have communicated with us? Well, it's possible. I tend to think Neanderthal language would have been, simpler, because they did live somewhat simpler lives. They probably lived in smaller groups. We know modern humans live in larger groups and network more widely. So I think our language would have been more complex. But yes, they could have spoken. Yes, they did have a degree of symbolic expression. We know that the last Neanderthals seem to have been using jewellery, which is obviously something that modern humans do to send a message about yourself. And Neanderthals did that. So I think there would have been a degree of communication. And clearly, hybrid children were brought up in modern human groups. Otherwise, we wouldn't have Neanderthal DNA with us now.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that genetic legacy, it leaves its mark still today. Can we identify specific traits?
Yeah, so it's, we can't sort of pick up features in the skull in the way that some people, thought you could. I mean, there's no evidence that people with a slightly bigger brow ridge have got more Neanderthal DNA, for example. But it's certainly there in terms of an association between bits of DNA in our genomes that we know are correlated with certain diseases, certain conditions. There is also a correlation when you look at the genome of where there are patches of Neanderthal DNA. So, for example, the immune system, it looks like we picked up some of the immune defences of the Neanderthals. And that kind of makes sense, because we had evolved in Africa. They'd been evolving in Europe and Asia for hundreds of thousands of years. So they would have developed natural resistances to the diseases and pathogens outside of Africa. By interbreeding with them, we got a quick fix to our immune systems. Now that's the good news, but the bad news is some people think that this also triggered the development of some autoimmune conditions we have today. So in some ways our immune system might now be oversensitive with that Neanderthal DNA in it. So there's a suggestion that conditions like lupus and biliary cirrhosis and Crohn's disease might be related to the presence of Neanderthal DNA. Also, supposedly, the inability to give up smoking.
Oh!
Now, that's a pretty weird one, because there was never any tobacco in the old world when modern humans and Neanderthals were around. But possibly there's something there about addictive behaviour that's somehow correlated with the presence of Neanderthal DNA. So a lot of questions here, and we're only beginning to look at that.
Wow. So pros and cons of dating a Neanderthal.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. Yep.
So we've got a question from Periscope. I Am Galaxy is asking, why were they mainly found in Europe and settled there?
Okay, so Neanderthals, because yes, the most common Neanderthal sites are the European sites, but actually they range very widely. So I think we have an abnormal picture of where the Neanderthals are, because the first ones were found in Europe. There's the biggest density of archaeologists, if you like, working on that time period in Europe. There are many parts of the world where Neanderthals almost certainly were living from stone tool evidence, but we don't have the fossils. So we know they were in Siberia. They were right over in Siberia at times. They were in Uzbekistan, they were in Israel, Iraq, and places like that. So they might have even been in India, they might even have been in China. So I think they range much more widely. We have a completely unbalanced picture because most of our finds are coming from Europe, but actually their range is also most of the way across Asia as well.
It's a really interesting point. Now we have a question from Marius Florin on Facebook that linked to that, saying, how long have we been collecting information about Neanderthals?
How long have we been collecting information? Well, obviously the first fossils were found, way back. So yes, the earliest Neanderthal fossils obviously were found in Neander Valley, Germany, in Gibraltar, in Belgium, and so that was the beginning of the story. In terms of the cultural evidence, the stone tools, again, yes, at least that length of time we've been finding their stone tools. Of course, the DNA evidence really only started to come in 1997 with tiny bits of mitochondrial DNA, which seemed a huge breakthrough, but no one could have imagined that 10 years later we'd be talking about whole genomes of Neanderthals. That's how fast things are moving. Yeah.
Absolutely. Now, speaking of the genome, Deborah on Facebook is asking, have the X and Y chromosomes been looked at for Neanderthal DNA?
Yes, they have, yes. So the Y chromosome certainly shows no Neanderthal DNA on it in modern humans. And there is some evidence, it's controversial, but there is some possibility that when there was hybrid matings, the male children of those matings might have been less fertile than the daughters. So it's possible that most of the transmission of the Neanderthal DNA actually went through the daughters of those offspring, not the sons. They may have been much less fertile, possibly infertile. And this is something which you do find when mammal and bird species mate. It's sometimes the sex that has the non-matching chromosome X and Y that has the greater difficulty in passing that DNA on. So yeah, so the X and the Y have been looked at, and yes, the X chromosomes have got Neanderthal DNA in them, the Y chromosome doesn't.
Now we've got a question from Periscope. Ted Bell asks, how did the recent Moroccan fossil find change things, the timeline, for example?
Yes, so this is so we've got here that Moroccan fossil from about 300,000 years ago from Jebel Ihud. So recently published the dating and study of more fossils from there. So at 300,000 years, this is double the age we thought it was. So the view was, until this year, that Morocco, because of evidence like that, was actually lagging behind the rest of Africa. So we have modern human fossils in Ethiopia at close to 200,000 years old. So Morocco, at a younger date, had more primitive humans, so Morocco was unimportant. Now we actually know that's the oldest clear member of our Homo sapiens lineage. It's primitive in some ways. The face looks quite modern, but the brain case shape is still rather more like these archaic humans. So it does show us a much more primitive sapiens at a much earlier stage of evolution, closer to our common ancestor with the Neanderthals.
Brilliant, and a fantastic find to end on as well, because unfortunately we are out of time. Chris, thank you so much for talking to us today.
It's been a pleasure.
Brilliant.
Thank you.
And thank you guys for joining us and for all your brilliant questions as well. Now do remember to join us again next week.